Well, thank you very much, Manning Clark House, for inviting me to address you this evening. It's indeed a great honour to stand at this lectern. Some hard acts to follow. Imagine speaking after your own mum. This being the first Manning Clark lecture since the failure of the referendum on the voice to Parliament, I wish to acknowledge that Manning himself identified that one of Australia's most profound moral failings was the dispossession, violence and systemic discrimination faced by Indigenous Australians following colonisation. Manning argued that the failure to properly acknowledge and address this injustice has had long-lasting consequences for Australian identity and our social cohesion. Manning argued, so while a majority of Australians voted no at the referendum, I wonder if more of us had been exposed to a truer history of European settlement and its lasting impact on Indigenous Australians, might we have landed on a different result? Manning spoke of two groups of Australian leaders, the punishers and straighteners and the enlargers. The punishers and straighteners see our future as constrained by the chains of our British origins, and they look askance at any suggestion that we should break those bonds. The enlargers see opportunity everywhere if only we allow ourselves to match our imagination with courage. Sadly, the punishers and straighteners outplayed the enlargers at the referendum. I'm sure Manning would have been disappointed that 33 years after his passing, we still haven't found a way for our Constitution to acknowledge the 3,000 generations of Australian history that came before. Before going further, let me acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, their elders and their ancestors on whose lands we gather, and I extend my respect to any First Nations persons present today. We can only be in awe of the resilience of your culture. So I'm here to talk about energy transition, the need, the opportunity, and the politics that will determine our success or failure. Manning Clark recognised that Australia's phenomenal natural resources have been a fundamental force in shaping our nation. Thanks to this unique land, since the 19th century, Australia has experienced one boom after another. First the gold rush, followed by copper and tin. Our farmers generated huge wealth from wheat and wool, and our land has kept giving: coal, iron ore, nickel, bauxite, uranium and gas. Today, Australia is the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world, trailing only Russia and Saudi Arabia. When Australians scoffed at the UAE, famous as a petrostate, for hosting the UN's 28th annual climate conference in Dubai last year, we failed to acknowledge that we extract nearly twice as much fossil fuels each year. Coal and gas rank as our second and third biggest exports, and they make up a combined 1/4 of our export income. Today, Australia faces a Kodak moment. The phrase Kodak moment was once a great marketing term for capturing the special moments in life to be shared later, but has since become associated with the Eastman Kodak Company's fall from market dominance to bankruptcy. Kodak helped invent digital photography, but it held on to its film and processing businesses so tightly while the market rapidly transitioned to a better product. Kodak had everything it needed, its brand, technology and cash, to bring a product like Facebook or Instagram to market and to create a lucrative online world for sharing these Kodak moments. It didn't, of course. The world went by and Kodak filed for bankruptcy in 2012, the same year that Facebook acquired Instagram. In Australia's case, we have for now a robust fossil fuel export sector, but also a clear understanding that the fundamentals of that trade are deteriorating. Our major coal and gas customers, Japan, China, South Korea, Taiwan and India, are all committed to phasing down and ultimately phasing out demand for these imports. But their voracious demand for energy will not subside. Within that, there is great opportunity for Australia. Right now, we face a choice as a nation. Are we going to have our own Kodak moment? We can hold on to fossil fuels as tightly as Kodak held on to film, or we can produce a future in which we increase our prosperity as a leader in global decarbonisation. Our punishers and straighteners are looking in the rearview mirror. Their gaze is fixed firmly on the past. Our enlargers are looking through the windscreen towards a richer, safer and cleaner Australia. We can see an Australia that not only plays a major international role responding to the greatest challenge of our time, global heating, but one that prospers greatly by doing so. This is Australia's moment to shine. Science has shown us the direction, policy turned us towards it and put us into first gear, and economics has put a foot on the accelerator. We are now moving, but not fast enough. As environmentalist Bill McKibben says, winning slowly is losing. We're going to have to move up through the gears, and that's going to require more enlargers. We can't let the punishers and the straighteners slam us into reverse. First, the science. Over hundreds of millions of years, natural processes sequestered thousands of gigatons of carbon deep underground. But over just a couple of hundred years, we've dug it up, burnt it, and now dumped 1.5 trillion tonnes of its waste into the air. As Al Gore puts it, we've used the sky as an open sewer. 2024 marks 200 years exactly since French mathematician and physicist Joseph Fourier discovered that atmospheric gases keep our planet warm. It's 168 years since Eunice Foote proved that carbon dioxide was one of those gases. We've known for decades that our burning of fossil fuels is heating our planet and the impact this will have on nature, security, food systems, health, and the infrastructure upon which our civilization depends. We have known the hazards. Our scientists knew, our companies knew, and our politicians knew. As far back as 1973, Senator Don Jessup, the South Australian optometrist who chaired the Senate Standing Committee on Science and the Environment, told Parliament that the silent pollutant, carbon dioxide, is increasing in the atmosphere and will cause us great concern in the future. Jessup stressed the urgency of transitioning away from fossil fuels and argued that Australia could be a global leader in clean energy. Over just 200 years, we have increased the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide by more than 50%, most of that in the 5 decades since Jessup spoke so passionately. To arrest warming and maintain a livable climate, we need to stop burning the carbon under our feet. We've built a mighty civilization on the back of Prometheus's gift, but now we need to swap fire for electrons. We need to replace coal and gas power stations with wind, solar, hydro, and storage. And we need to electrify everything. We need to replace combustion vehicles with EVs. We need to stop using gas in our homes and instead use electricity for heating, cooling, and cooking. We need industry to replace gas with electrical processes wherever possible. The majority of these conversions are already entirely possible and economic. It will be far more difficult to decarbonise aviation, shipping, and some industrial processes. For these, we are going to need green electricity to make green hydrogen, and with it, green molecules such as ammonia and methanol. Between the green electrons and green molecules, we can wean ourselves off fossil fuels. And this is what we mean when we talk about energy transition. Thankfully, Australia is in a better position than almost any other country for this transition. When Donald Horne dubbed Australia the lucky country, it was a sharp critique that our massive natural wealth and isolation had insulated us from the hardships endured by other nations and had kept us in a state of arrested development. Horne was warning us that one day our luck would run out. But our lucky streak continues. Half the lithium produced in the world right now comes from Australia. We are the only country that has all the minerals required to make the batteries that are in high demand for electrifying cars and firming the world's renewables for when the wind don't blow and the sun don't shine. We have phenomenal reserves of all of the minerals required for the energy transition. Not just lithium, but copper, cobalt, nickel, magnesium, silicon, rare earths. and also the iron ore and bauxite needed to produce steel and aluminium. But it's not just minerals. As Dorothea McKellar observed, we live in a wide brown land, a sunburnt country under a pitiless blue sky. This vast, mineral-rich landscape is blessed with the highest per capita wind and solar resources in the developed world. This is important because while it is relatively cheap to move energy in the form of fossil fuels between continents, it is much more expensive to move green energy. In the current world, we ship coal and gas to smelters and furnaces overseas. In a decarbonising world, the smelters and furnaces will come to us. Thanks to our phenomenal natural advantages, we can produce far more energy than we need and at a lower cost than most countries. Instead of just shipping off raw materials, we can use our energy advantages to process the minerals and add the value here in Australia. Our previous booms have endowed us with capabilities, institutions, and access to capital required to develop this new economy. In short, in a decarbonising world, Australia is poised to become a clean energy superpower. We have the highest per capita emissions of any major country, and when you factor in our fossil exports, we are responsible for 4.5% of global emissions, placing us 5th in the world. Thanks to our advantages, it will be easier for us than most to slash our emissions, and we're well placed to help others with theirs. The Superpower Institute, of which I'm proud to be associated, finds that by exploiting our competitive advantages, Australia could reduce global emissions by around 8%. Not only can we make a significant dent on global emissions, but we're going to be paid handsomely for doing so. We have a combination of success factors like no other country, but our advantages shrink if others leap ahead. The USA's so-called Inflation Reduction Act is an ambitious industrial policy which is attracting capital away from countries like Australia. Meanwhile, developers are scouting for superpower projects throughout South America and North Africa. As Australian income from fossil fuel exports inevitably declines, this superpower opportunity is our best chance of maintaining and growing our country's great fortunes. But unfortunately, this vision is not shared by all. The Coalition is actively campaigning against this energy transition, particularly in Queensland, despite the Sunshine State standing to attract so much of the investment in this big future. Labor is more willing to look at the opportunities ahead, but it lacks the requisite courage. How did we get to this point? The Federal Coalition has been on quite the journey over the last 35 years. In 1990, the Liberal Party under Andrew Peacock took a policy to the election to cut carbon emissions by 20% by the year 2000. This was probably the party's high point on climate, and surprisingly, the Nationals actually backed them in. Later, Prime Minister Howard legislated the renewable energy target. He would later confess that he was agnostic on the climate science, but ever the pragmatist, he knew how to read the public mood. It's not to say his renewable energy target was ambitious. The target, to increase the renewable share of electricity by just 2 percentage points over a decade, was met years early, and Howard ignored the industry pleas and expert opinions to increase his target. As the 2007 election approached, Howard, again the pragmatist, couldn't ignore the public mood, no doubt influenced by the Millennium Drought and Al Gore's film An Inconvenient Truth. He went to the election pledging a price on carbon. While it was too much for many in Howard's party room, it was clearly not enough for the voting public. Kevin 07 had campaigned on climate change as if he meant it and was rewarded with the keys to the lodge. Under Malcolm Turnbull, the Liberals cooperated with Rudd on climate, but while Howard had been able to keep the right flank of his party in check, they didn't trust Turnbull and they never accepted him as a fellow traveller. In the face of growing discontent, Turnbull proclaimed, "I will not lead a party that is not as committed to effective action on climate change as I am." Well, very quickly it became clear that many in his party room were indeed not as committed as he was. And shortly afterwards, he lost the leadership by just one vote. And thus began the next phase of the Coalition's climate stance, opportunistic denialism. Abbott brought a new style of politics. The political pugilism wasn't new. Keating too had belittled his opponent to great effect, but where Keating had employed wit, Abbott dumbed it down for the politically disengaged. Abbott and his strategist Credlin found great power in relentlessly opposing everything the government stood for. Climate science denial wasn't new, but where Howard kept it in check, lest it alienate voters, Abbott employed it mercilessly to undermine the government. Australia had once enjoyed a kind of bipartisanship on decarbonisation. Yes, it was a fragile and half-hearted bipartisanship, but Abbott's style was to give no ground, to oppose everything, to smash things up. In this environment, Labor blinked, deposed its leader, and took a beating at the 2010 federal election. Prime Minister Gillard found herself leading a minority government with a pro-climate crossbench of Greens and Independents. Despite civil war within Labor, the minority government laid the foundations of the transition: a price on carbon, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Meanwhile, Abbott and his sidekick Barnaby Joyce ran a relentless campaign to undermine the government. Unsurprisingly, their predictions of $100 lamb roasts and the wipeout of Whyalla never eventuated. Labor's comprehensive loss at the 2013 election was pinned on their strong support of climate action, yet I would argue the real causes were Labor Party dysfunction, Abbott's devastatingly effective style of opposition, and the unwavering support of the Liberal Party's media arm, News Corp. Prime Minister Abbott moved in like a wrecking ball. The very first order of business was to abolish the Climate Commission. He tried and failed to kill ARENA and the CEFC. He gave the RET a great big haircut, and on 17th of July 2014, Abbott delivered on his promise to axe the tax when Australia became the first country in the world to remove a price on carbon. On the 28th of September 2016, in a once-in-50-year storm, tornadoes ripped through South Australia, tearing up transmission towers, and set off a cascading series of events that ended up in a statewide blackout. Despite expert advice to the contrary, the coalition government pointed the blame squarely at renewables, alleging that South Australia went too hard, too fast into renewables. Chief Scientist Alan Finle was commissioned to review Australia's energy transition. The Finle review found, much to the government's great surprise, that the prescription was not less renewable energy, but indeed much more. Finle proposed a clean energy target to facilitate the deployment of the necessary generation and storage, and the idea lasted only days before the coalition backbenchers ensured that the proposal was taken out the back and shot. Along with more generation and storage, Finle stressed the need for better planning, kicking off a major biennial modelling exercise by the Australian energy market operator called the Integrated System Plan. The ISP is an extraordinary body of work. It's a roadmap showing, with unprecedented level of rigour, that the optimal path forward for Australia is the continued phase-out of coal, replaced by wind and solar, firmed with storage, and backed up with a very small amount of gas. Now in its fourth edition, there are just two types of energy commentators in Australia: those who understand the ISP and those who are blind or ignorant to its profound implications. Despite the fact that more than one-third of Australians sleep under a solar panel, most would be forgiven for thinking that we're at the beginning of the energy transition. The naysayers and deniers paint a picture that we're at a crossroads. Turn left for a renewable future, go straight ahead for coal and gas, turn right for nuclear. But the truth is, John Howard started that left turn when he legislated the RET. We were slow to get going, but the acceleration has been impressive. 12 years ago, only 10% of our electricity came from renewable energy. We're now at 38%. In the main ISP scenario, in 12 years, our main grid is projected to exceed 95% renewables. In the last 6 years, we've added 46 terawatt hours of annual renewable energy generation to the grid. And for those who like to think in such terms, this is the equivalent of building 6 nuclear power stations in 6 years. And most of this was during a period when the federal government was hostile to renewables. Only Norway, the Netherlands and Sweden are currently adding renewables faster than Australia, and no other country generates more solar power per capita than Australia does right now. Today, South Australia generates twice as much energy from renewables as it did in 2016, the year of the blackout, and by 2027, the state is expected to meet 100% net renewables. And while renewables are ramping up, storage is also a huge success story. After that famous wager between Mike Cannon-Brookes and Elon Musk, what was then the world's largest lithium-ion battery silently roared into life in South Australia in November 2017. It took 6 years to 2022 to reach a total of 1 gigawatt hour of storage, which is about 8 times as much as that first battery. Last year, we installed that much again. This year, we'll install 3 gigawatt hours, and developers are already building an additional 10 gigawatt hours to be delivered next year. We are among the world leaders in transforming our grid with renewable energy because we are playing to our strengths. So has that coalition come around? Are they excited by Australia's progress? Unfortunately not. As Professor Michael Mann, a leading climate scientist, has noted, climate denial has morphed into climate delay. A decade ago, right-wing politicians, think tanks and media lent into climate denial, casting doubt on the science of climate change and undermining the scientists. Fast forward today, and the public's understanding of the science and their lived experience of a changing climate have made denial no longer acceptable. Professor Mann talks about all the tools of delay, and they all start with the letter D: downplaying the problem, deflecting to secondary concerns, fomenting division amongst those who want action, deferring action with future fantasy solutions like geoengineering, carbon capture and storage, and small modular reactors. These lead to defeatism, the feeling that it's too late, as well as disengagement, all sap the momentum to double down on climate action. In Australia, we're seeing the think tanks of the punishers and straighteners systematically undermine confidence in the CSIRO and AEMO, leading Peter Dutton to claim that these trusted institutions have been discredited. We're seeing campaigners make bogus claims that offshore wind farms will kill whales and that solar farms will threaten our food security. Unfortunately, the coalition laps it up. In 2021, the Energy Minister, Angus Taylor, urged his colleagues to support the passage of a bill to enable the development of offshore wind. And he said, the industry would create jobs, strengthen the economy, and facilitate a more affordable and secure energy system. In opposition, his successor, Ted O'Brien, now speaks at rallies opposing offshore wind. When in state government, Andrew Constance was a strong supporter of renewables, and he warned us against the vocal minorities undermining the transition. But now, as a Liberal candidate for Gilmore, he has joined those same vocal minorities. Coalition politicians would have us believe that renewables don't work. The problem for them is that renewables are working. During their 9 years in power, despite efforts to slow down the transition, renewables grew by 250%. Over the same period, the cost of renewables plummeted. As the International Energy Agency has reported, solar is now the cheapest form of electricity in human history. The gap between the coalition's worldview and reality widens with every solar panel and every wind turbine installed. Now, against that backdrop, the coalition has introduced a debate over nuclear energy. Consideration of nuclear power in Australia is not new. The Gorton government started construction of our first nuclear power station in Jervis Bay in 1969, and in 1971, McMahon's government killed it off. Nothing significant happened in nuclear power in Australia for 27 years until John Howard banned the energy source in 1998. But during the next 18 years of their time in federal government, the coalition left the ban in place. So why has Dutton put nuclear on the agenda now? Well, partly it's one of those false solutions mentioned by Michael Mann, just like CCS and clean coal before it. It delays the energy transition. It's a distraction that buys coal and gas sectors a little more time while we engage in a pointless debate. But there's another reason, what political analysts call a dead cat. When politicians want to shift your attention, one solution is to throw a metaphorical dead cat on the table. You'll drop the current topic and ask, why the hell is there a dead cat on the table? Let's first consider the March 2023 by-election in the outer Melbourne seat of Aston. The Liberals should have retained the seat. Not since 1920 had an opposition lost a seat to the government at a by-election. But it lost it comprehensively. When members of the party would have been questioning his strategy to forgo inner-city Teal seats and focus on taking outer suburban Battler seats off Labor, Dutton had to act. His bold captain's call to oppose the Voice was the dead cat. In that moment, the referendum was as good as lost. No referendum has ever passed when opposed by the leader of the opposition. A year later came the Dunkley by-election, another one of those suburban outer seats that Dutton needed to win. This time, Labor's honeymoon was well and truly over. After the referendum loss, painful cost of living squeeze with 12 interest rates in a row, the Libs should surely have been competitive. And despite a raft of tailwinds and a $300,000 campaign run against Labor by right-wing campaign group Advance, the Libs lost another by-election. Dutton knew again what to do. 2 days after the election, he announced the coalition would take a bold nuclear policy to the election. Another dead cat thrown onto the table. Another captain's call, another cutting off discussion about the failure of his political strategy. While we could debate the Voice for the next 100 years and sadly get nowhere, Dutton's nuclear plan is different. It faces strong economic and technical barriers that cannot survive contact with reality. Maybe we have got to the place in the Enlightenment project when there really are facts and alternative facts, but I don't think we're yet at the point where you can fool most of the people all of the time. If we ever see nuclear power in Australia, it won't be under Peter Dutton. But in the meantime, it gives Dutton a chance to show that he's bold, and some voters really like boldness. When Dutton announced the proposed sites for his nuclear reactors, 3 challenges were put to him. What if communities are opposed? What about state legislation that bans nuclear? What if the owners of the proposed sites refuse to sell? Well, Dutton came out with the strongman responses. He said, if the communities oppose, they're going to have to abide by the national interest. For the states where nuclear is banned, the Commonwealth will exercise its powers. And if a site owner refuses to sell, well, there's always compulsory acquisition. All of this would be messy, and none of it would ever happen. But Dutton gets to show us that he means business. It reminds me a lot of Donald Trump when he commented that when he pledged that he was going to build a big, beautiful wall across the entire US-Mexico border and make Mexico pay for it. Remember that? It showed Trump was a tough guy, that he's prepared to do the hard things and it's not going to cost you a cent. Interestingly, both major parties appear to be relishing this nuclear debate. The coalition has found an energy policy, or rather a policy-shaped object, that to the disengaged voter sounds like a solution. The public have seen their electricity bills going up and they're hungry for simple solutions to complex problems. The coalition wants them to believe that adding the most expensive form of generation some decades from now is going to somehow help today's cost of living crisis. It can't. And it won't. For its part, Labor believes the coalition has made a huge strategic mistake, and it wants the coalition to speak about nuclear every day from here to the election. One of the coalition's arguments, I think, would have driven Manning mad. They say, dozens of other countries have nuclear, so why shouldn't we? The punishers and straighteners would turn their back on our bounteous gifts, and they instead look abroad for a country to copy. I think it's the energy equivalent of the cultural cringe. We can blame the politicians, but I believe that many fighting for the transition have made one big mistake. We have allowed the energy transition to sound hard. We have talked about energy transition as if it's going to be a great disruption. We have allowed the energy transition to be framed as optional, expensive, and a sacrifice. I take issue with the experts who claim that this will be our most difficult transition ever. The reality is that for most Australians, the energy transition will pass largely unnoticed. Cars, planes, radio, television, personal computers, the internet, mobile phones and AI, just to name a few of the transitions of the last century, these have all impacted our lives more and faster than the energy transition ever will. Right now, not even 0.5% of Australians work to supply the energy for our domestic and export sectors. In 2050, if we grow our economy to be a clean energy superpower, maybe that'll grow to as high as 2%. As our customers phase down the demand for fossil fuels, there will be job losses. The disruption, though, will be far less and far slower than the collapse of our car and textile industries, and there's absolutely no reason we can't look after every single affected worker. Few urban Australians, and that's 90% of us, are going to notice any changes. When you flip the switch, the lights will turn on. When you turn the hot water tap, hot water will come out. If you drive a car, you'll drive a better car, one with better torque, less noise, and no need to be regularly gouged at the bowser. You will use energy more efficiently, and it will cost you much less than the alternative. Some parts of the economy will move faster than others, but for most people, the changes will be imperceptibly slow. Most rural and regional Australians will likewise be unaffected by the energy transition. There'll be wind and solar farms dotted here and there, just as there are now, and some areas, those with exceptional resources, will attract significant development. In many ways, it'll be like mining. There are communities around the country oriented around significant mines, but the vast majority of Australians have had no direct interaction with the mining boom. Most Australians have never visited or worked in a mine and rarely give the sector any thought. The same will be true for the superpower industries and the communities built around them. Maybe some will be concerned that I'm not projecting a sense of urgency. Believe me, I feel it, and I feel it acutely. We're now at the position where the transition is inevitable, but it's just a matter of speed. Audrey Zibelman, the CEO of AEMO, who brought us the first integrated system plan, used to say that we know where we are and we know where we're going, but there are two ways to get there. We can have a managed transition or a chaotic disruption. If the path is too slow or too chaotic, people will get hurt. So to thread this needle, we need our governments to create the regulations and incentives to ensure that this transition happens at pace, that it protects the vulnerable and captures the significant upsides for our nation. In a recent interview, Paul Keating described leadership as founded on imagination and matched with courage. He spoke of imagination coming from the bubbling cauldron inside us, which gave what he called the rise to go beyond the ordinary. But the old parties are stuck in the doldrums of the ordinary, which helps explain why 1/3 of Australians have deserted them in recent decades. Instead of igniting their bubbling cauldron, every day the Liberal Party inhales bad advice from News Corp commentators, encouraging them to move further and further towards denial. Peter Credlin, the architect of Abbott's electoral win, but also his failed prime ministership, preaches on Sky News that Morrison lost the election because he went too woke. Really. Many MPs and the dwindling Liberal membership lap this up, and they follow the advice. Peacock's commitment to climate action was a reflection of what the Liberal Party once was. Howard's, a politically pragmatic response to the public consciousness. Morrison's contemptuous failure to hold a hose, mate, during the apocalyptic bushfires of 2019 and 20 mirrored his inaction on climate during his almost 4 years in office. Dutton's nuclear distraction and his opposition to Australia's Paris commitments show a leader even more dismissive of climate action and of our natural advantages than any of his predecessors. Although they sit in different party rooms and lead different parties, both Dutton and Littleproud are members of Queensland's Liberal National Party. There are now more parliamentary members of the Queensland LNP than there are Liberal MPs and senators from New South Wales and Victoria combined. That broad church is long gone. the Liberal Party of Menzies is long dead. For its part, Labor has made plodding progress on climate. Stronger targets, yes, fuel efficiency standards, an embryonic clean industry policy, and an investment framework to help usher in the necessary investment in renewables and storage. But on the flip side, Minister Plibersek gives environmental approval to coal and gas projects, and the government subsidises fossil fuel exploration. The government is thumbing its nose at the message from the International Energy Agency and the IPCC that we cannot open any more coal, oil or gas projects if we are to keep warming to 1.5 degrees. Resource Minister King's future gas strategy, a plan for the expansion of the gas industry to 2050 and beyond, demonstrates West Australia's powerful grip on this government. Gas is king in Western Australia. The state is totally captured by the industry. Gas sponsors their arts, gas sponsors their sports, and gas sponsors their politicians. Former ministers and premiers go to work for the industry, and the proprietor of the town's only big newspaper has big gas interests. Labor holds 9 seats in Western Australia, having won 4 at the last election, aided by the halo of now departed Premier Mark McGowan. A Labor majority runs through WA. The loss of any seat in WA will push the party towards minority. This explains a good deal of Labor's timidity around gas and gambling reform. Neither party wants to wrestle with our export emissions. In fact, to the contrary, Australia often plays an unconstructive role in global negotiations in order to protect our trade in coal and gas. It's abundantly clear that neither Labor nor the Coalition will spontaneously step up to the superpower challenge. One wants to take us backwards and the other is too timid to get us out of first gear. We need a new form of politics. We must take it upon ourselves to find that rise that's needed to recast Australia's economy. For many in the climate movement, 2019's election was supposed to be a climate election, but of course it wasn't to be. On election night, a victorious Scott Morrison stood before the nation and proclaimed, "I have always believed in miracles." Victory was more likely due to a string of Labor missteps and Clive Palmer's $94 million advertising blitz. But in 2022, we finally got the climate election we'd hoped for, and the most fundamental realignment of Australia's politics in a generation. As well as losing 10 seats to Labor, the Liberal Party lost 6 of its most prized seats to the Community Independents, along with another 2 to the Greens. The Community Independents, labelled the Teals by the media, tapped into the zeitgeist with a deep commitment to a science-based response to the climate crisis, restoring integrity of politics, and bringing safety and respect for women in Australia. Personally, I have never believed in miracles. The credit for the success of the independents must go to the tens of thousands of Australians, most of whom were new to politics, some of whom are in this room tonight, who shared the common values, felt the thrill of possibility, worked hard and loved the journey. They're assisted by Climate 200, the 11,200 person strong crowdfunding group I convened, but they were helped even more by Howard, Abbott, Morrison, whose collective legacy was a vacuum ready to be filled by a hopeful centrist movement. Moreover, the independents were helped by Zali Steggall and Helen Haines, who struck a chord with Australians through the 46th Parliament. Without Steggall's relentless pursuit of action on climate and Haines' dogged advocacy for a National Integrity Commission, neither climate nor integrity would have been issues on which the last election was fought. Together, the independents have shown us a hint of a new kind of politics. Unencumbered by the weight of party allegiance, uncompromised by the ugly process of advancement through political ranks, each independent has given their community a genuine voice in Canberra. The independents take expert, evidence-based advice and they put issues on the agenda. They bring new ideas, they hold the government to account, but instead of reflexively opposing everything as the opposition does, they push the government to be better. Shortly before he died, Malcolm Fraser was helping a small working group develop a plan for a new political party. I was privileged to attend a few meetings. In his post-parliamentary career, he'd become good friends with Barry Jones. And Barry suggested to him that the party be called the Courage Party. The Courage Party never eventuated, But now I think we have something better, true independence with that courage. Instead of doing the easy thing and sticking to careers they loved and excelled in, they did something hard and uncomfortable, and they answered the call of their communities. Each connected their community's imagination with courage, and they took it all the way to Parliament House. This all happened in the context of a changing electoral landscape. For the first time in decades, baby boomers are no longer dominant. In 2013, boomers made up 54% of voters, outnumbering millennials and Gen Z by 2 to 1. Within one electoral cycle from now, that ratio will be completely reversed. Only 52% of this younger cohort reports any party loyalty, compared with 85% of the boomers. This younger cohort is frustrated. No, they're angry. They're angry that there is no longer a realistic path to owning their own home. They're angry to be carrying education debts throughout their life. They're angry that the older generations are leaving them with a damaged planet. The demographics of the 21st century and the consequent fracturing of traditional party support make it more likely than not that the crossbench will grow. Smart independence, drawing on experts and evidence, beyond the reach of vested interests, are the enlargers that we need to ensure that the government does its part to secure our superpower future. As I stated earlier, Australia is facing its own Kodak moment. Kodak was eventually run out of business by the technology it helped invent. Wouldn't it be ironic if Australia, which played such a major role in the development of solar photovoltaics, suffered a similar fate? But there's a very real risk that the punishers and straighteners will have us turn our back on these natural advantages and lead us to our own Kodak moment. Alternatively, with a supermajority of enlargers, we can seize this superpower opportunity, and with it, great prosperity. Australia can graduate from a dig it up and ship it out quarry to a leader in the global transition to clean energy. Our vast array of minerals in high demand, processed with our low-cost clean energy, can secure prosperity for generations of Australians. An exciting future beckons. The urgency of the transition propels us forward. And with our ingenuity, our resources, and this new political landscape, we have everything needed to grasp this opportunity. If we do so, not only will we be doing our fair share of securing a safe climate, we'll be helping others to do theirs while enriching the lives of Australians for generations to come. If there ever was a time for enlargers, that time is now. Thank you.